A UN investigation concludes Israel carried out genocidal acts by destroying Gaza's main fertility clinic and maternity hospitals. Israel has rejected the report, which also alleges sexual violence. So what are the implications and will there be accountability? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. A United Nations Commission of Inquiry says Israel has been systematically using sexual and gender-based violence in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territory. This includes deliberate targeting of reproductive health facilities in Gaza, destroying fertility clinics, maternity hospitals, and the healthcare service. In the occupied Palestinian territory, investigators have documented a sharp increase in sexual abuse, including rape by Israeli forces and settlers. They've attacked both women and men, including detainees. UN experts also say Israel's actions in its war on Gaza, bombing densely populated areas, has caused disproportionate violence against women and children, who make up the majority of the 48,000 Palestinians killed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rubbished the report, branding the UN Human Rights Council as an anti-Israeli circus. So what are the implications of this investigation? Will anyone be held accountable? We'll be discussing this with our guests shortly. First, this report from Laura Khan.
Gaza's largest fertility clinic was a symbol of hope for thousands of Palestinian couples. But when Israeli forces shelled it in December 2023, they destroyed liquid nitrogen tanks storing 4,000 embryos, and with them, the chance for those couples to become parents. A UN independent commission of inquiry has found Israel prevented new life by intentionally attacking IVF centres and maternity wards in Gaza. It concludes such tactics amount to genocidal acts.
Our report finds that Israel has increasingly employed sexual, reproductive and other forms of gender-based violence against Palestinians as part of a broader effort to undermine their right to self-determination.
The report goes further and details the impact of Israel's abuse of women and girls across not only Gaza but also in the occupied Palestinian territories. It accuses Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war by blocking or delaying deliveries of food, medicine and humanitarian aid to Gaza. In a place where literacy levels were some of the highest in the world, Israel's destruction of educational facilities has replaced children's thirst for knowledge with hunger and starvation.
They're assembling this basically incontrovertible evidence, I believe, for that key part of one of the bases for genocide, for the definition of genocide. But the report also goes beyond its focus on the reproductive health and the attacks on women and girls. And it talks about the way in which Israel has imposed conditions on the people of Gaza which constitute life-threatening and indeed has life-threatened.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dismissed the report as unfounded and says the UN agency that commissioned it, the UN Human Rights Council, is anti-Semitic and a circus. Other Israeli political leaders echoed his comments. The International Court of Justice will hold hearings next month on Israel's obligation to allow aid into Gaza. Last year, the court found it plausible that Israeli forces carried out acts of genocide. In November, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. They're accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Despite the warrants, the report shows Israel's treatment of Palestinians hasn't changed, from sexual abuse and humiliation at the hands of soldiers and settlers to torture and rape in its prisons and detention centres. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Let's take a closer look at some of the findings of the UN report. It says Israel destroyed vital reproductive healthcare facilities, including Gaza's main fertility center, resulting in the loss of 4,000 embryos and limiting the reproductive capacity of Palestinians. The Commission found no credible evidence the clinic was being used for military purposes and concluded the destruction was intended to prevent births in Gaza. It describes this as a genocidal act. The investigation reveals that Israeli forces directly targeted women and girls. Acts, it says, constitute crimes against humanity. The report also highlights the severe and lasting consequences for Palestinian reproductive health and mental well-being. Israel's mission to the UN in Geneva has rejected the findings, calling them unfounded. Let's now bring in our guest for today's show. Sari Bashi is a program director at Human Rights Watch. She's joining us from the occupied West Bank. Mohammed Dahleh is a lawyer specialising in human rights. He joins us from occupied East Jerusalem. And in Istanbul, Turkey, Arwa Damon is the founder of the International Network for Aid, Relief and Assistance, INARA. Thank you all for being with us on Inside Story. Thank you for your time today. Sari Bashi in the occupied West Bank, if I can start with you. There have been many reports about the conduct of Israel in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territory, including one that Human Rights Watch did earlier this year in January 2025. What is particularly new and striking to you about this UN Commission report?
To me, the extent and consistency of the testimonies regarding the abuse of detainees, and particularly sexualized abuse of detainees, is important and horrifying. And I'm very glad that the report is focusing unabashedly on sexual abuse against men, because it's an issue that is often suppressed. It's very difficult to get that information because of the stigma that is attached to a victim of sexual abuse. It's important to get that out. And it's also important to ensure that the international community is supporting services for survivors, men and women, of sexual and gender-based violence.
Indeed, the Palestinian lawyer who worked with the Commission and interviewed some of the political prisoners in the occupied West Bank said that most of the prisoners avoid describing the sexual abuse and violence they experience because of the taboo of it. So do we in fact know the full extent of this sexual violence in the prisons?
I mean, part of the problem over the last 17 months, is that there has been so much contact between soldiers and Palestinian detainees, Palestinian civilians in their homes. Because of the extent of the detentions, at any given moment, there's more than 10,000 Palestinians subject to detention or imprisonment. The extent of the raids in the West Bank, the extent of Israeli violence in Gaza, including making people walk through checkpoints. Every interaction is an opportunity for violence and for sexual and gender-based violence. I don't think we can know what the extent of it is, but the report is a very clear warning that this is not one or two rotten apples. This is extensive. It needs to be addressed as such, both in terms of services, but also in terms of the international community, particularly the countries who are providing weapons and other assistance to the Israeli military, to take responsibility for the use that their weapons is supporting. And I'm talking in particular about the United States, the UK, and Germany, who need to suspend military assistance to the Israeli government because of the grave violations that those weapons are involved in.
Arwa, let me bring you into the conversation. You've travelled many times to Gaza over the past 2 years, Arwa. What is it that struck you most about this report? Does it confirm the reality on the ground that you've seen?
Right. I've been to Gaza 4 times over the last year. And actually, I should have been talking to you from Gaza right now. But after attempting to enter Gaza 5 times over the last 3 weeks, I have been notified that I have been basically banned by Israel from entering Gaza. But what I have witnessed, especially when it comes to what we don't necessarily tend to think of when we're talking about gender-based violence, but things like depriving mothers of the ability to gain proper nutrition, depriving pregnant women of the ability to be able to access proper health care. I remember on my first trip into Gaza roughly a year ago, in Rafah, and this was before Israel invaded Rafah. I went to one of the small maternity hospitals there, and I was speaking with the staff, and they were saying that there were 40 births a day that were happening. But here's the thing. Of those 40 births, only between 5 to 8 were actually happening in the hospital. These women were all having to give birth in unsafe, unsanitary conditions in their tents. And then you look at the way that so many families are finding themselves female-headed households. So oftentimes when families are being forcibly evacuated from neighborhoods, in some cases they have to cross through Israeli checkpoints, and that's where the men, and quite often teenage boys, are all getting arbitrarily mass detained, which leaves the women and their children in an increasingly vulnerable position, not to mention the numerous times where we have seen cases in the hospital of, women and children being, it would most certainly appear, directly targeted by snipers.
Yeah, the report says that women and girls were disproportionately directly targeted by the Israeli bombardment of Gaza's health system, Arwa, and you've described there the impact of that and what it's meant for Palestinian women's rights and their dignity as well. I'll come back to you for more on that in a bit. Let me ask you, Mohammed Dahleh, your thoughts about this report and the fact that the UN itself now is talking about genocide, which they have been very careful about in the past. It's quite significant, isn't it? Will this report, do you think, be taken more seriously? Can Israel brush aside this report's conclusion as it's done in the past?
Israel already has done that. Israel labeled this report and the Human Rights Council that published this report, because this was an investigation committee under the Human Rights Council, as a report coming from an anti-Israeli body, anti-Semite body, even a terror-supporting body. That's how they label now human rights organs of the United Nations. For them, the entire United Nations, for the Israeli government and for the Israeli public, the entire United Nation system is an anti-Semite body, and therefore it should be neglected, if not even sanctioned or punished, as they wanted the world to do with the International Criminal Court, and as already has been done by the Trump administration. So for Israel, this is something that they are not really taking seriously. They are attacking back the report and the Human Rights Council. And they say already we have actually left the Human Rights Council about a month ago. And that's exactly the reason why we are not member anymore in that council, because it's an anti-Israeli body and it's a body that supports terror. That's the one-sided way the Israelis see the reality. Sure. For them, anybody who doesn't align with the Israeli narrative is somebody who is supporting terror and is somebody who is anti-Semite. And therefore, I don't expect the Israeli government to accept any of the recommendations that the report mentions at the end of this very important
But the fact that, Mohammed Dahleh, if I can ask you, the fact that the report states that this is a deliberate policy by Israel, that it's a method of war, would that not, will that not force them to respond in one way or another? They're being accused of using this as a method of war.
This actually now fosters the arrest order issued by the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court already has issued arrest orders to the Prime Minister of Israel and to the previous Minister of Defense, Gallant. And those arrest orders were issued on similar grounds.
So do you think this adds into that case?
Yeah, of course. This report now will be a great way of evidence, and an added weight of evidence in that case that we see that has been already neglected or has been treated in a weird way, if to put it that way, by the international community, especially the United States and many other countries who are declaring that they will not respect the orders issued by the International Criminal Court.
All right. Sari, Bashi, let me come to you and ask you about intent here, because that's highlighted several times in this report. On the destruction of the IVF clinic in Gaza, for example, the Basma Center, the report says the commission concludes that this was done with the intent to destroy the Palestinians in Gaza. Proving intent is difficult, isn't it? How do you think they came to this particular conclusion?
I mean, we haven't researched that particular attack, and it's very difficult. It requires extensive research and investigation to be able to make a determination about any one attack. What I can say is that we have found that the Israeli government is committing the crime against humanity of extermination. And that is based on an intent to deprive people of the conditions of life necessary for their survival. And that is a conclusion we've reached not because of any one particular attack, but because of the systematic destruction of water infrastructure, refusal of entry for materials needed to provide people with food and water. Basically, if you knowingly cut off the things that people need, like food and water, because human beings can't live without food and water, then you are essentially depriving them of the conditions that they need to survive. And, we had issued a significant report in December concluding that crime against humanity was being committed. During the ceasefire until recently, there had been an improvement in bringing in humanitarian items. But, for the last week and a half, there has been absolutely no humanitarian assistance allowed into Gaza. And what we're seeing is, worsening of those conditions that people need to live. And what needs to happen is immediate mobilization of diplomatic pressure on the Israeli government to reopen the crossings. It was done at an earlier stage in the war. For the first couple of weeks, the crossings were entirely closed. And then under pressure at that point from the United States, the Israeli government allowed some humanitarian assistance in. The United States is not in any outward way exerting that pressure. Other countries need to do so, in particular countries that are allies of Israel, and in particular countries who are supplying it with weapons.
Right. Arwa, what has the blockade that we've seen in the last 10 days, over 10 days now, of the Gaza Strip, what has that meant for women in Gaza? And, we were talking about the fact that, their rights and dignity were in question. I mean, with this report, it was clearly highlighted. What has this meant for them? And on the question of sexual violence as well, has that been documented in Gaza as well?
So it's also important to note that while we do have this blockade happening right now, it's not the first time that we have seen, supplies in Gaza significantly decrease to the point where they are actually detrimental to the health and survival of the population there. This has historically, over the course of the last 16, 17 months, been a tactic that we have seen. And it extends beyond food and water, because you also have things like hygiene products that end up being denied entry, sanitary pads being denied entry. And so if you, think about just that one small aspect of this for, women and girls who need sanitary pads every single month, who need to be able to keep themselves clean, that becomes an impossibility. And that leads to all sorts of infections and diseases. You also have, for example, mothers who have just given birth who are unable to breastfeed their children. One of the clinics that my charity Inara supports, a small field clinic, actually has a neonatal specialist in it. And she's really struggling because all of these, mothers aren't able to produce enough milk, if any at all, to be able to feed their children. But you can't find sufficient baby powder, not on the market and not even among the supplies that have been coming in, because it's always been a struggle to try to get this sort of thing in. If we talk about electricity and the way that Israel cut off the electricity, which plunges Gaza into darkness, which creates incredibly dangerous situations, especially for women and girls when they want to go to the bathroom in any of these, makeshift camps or shelters that they're finding themselves in. And so historically speaking, we have really been seeing the impact of, the way that Israel has been restricting humanitarian aid and access of humanitarian workers, really impacting the female population in a significant way. Right.
So now the question is, what happens with this report, this particular report, just bringing back to it. Mohammed Dahleh, the Commission's report obviously will be submitted to the ICJ and the ICC. The ICJ has already found allegations of genocide were plausible a year ago. How much weight will this new report add to the case? And, what do you see countries, as Sari mentioned, countries that are supplying weapons to Israel, for example, what will be their responsibility now going forward?
I mean, as far as the ICJ is concerned, I think this report will be a vital piece of evidence before the ICJ. As you know, the ICJ cannot go itself to the occupied territories. It cannot get to the West Bank. Actually, Israel prevents even the members of the Human Rights Council or investigators from the Human Rights Council to come to enter to the Gaza Strip. So they rely heavily on reports coming from human rights agencies and from human rights bodies. Therefore, this report will be a great and important piece of evidence before the ICJ. As you said, it has already found that it's plausible that Israel has committed genocide or genocidal acts in Gaza. And I think this report will be a great addition in the case that South Africa has brought before the ICJ. As far as other governments is concerned, I do think that this report cannot be now neglected. Those governments cannot turn a blind eye on important reports coming from international bodies, from the UN system, from the Human Rights Council. I mean, the whole international law and order is based on those bodies. And this is a very respectful body of the United Nations, the Human Rights Council.
Right.
And a report that is coming after such an extensive investigation, I think will have its weight on those governments. And I do hope that they use it as a tool to exercise pressure on Israel to change its policies on the ground.
All right, Sari, the ICJ in its advisory opinion talked about the obligation of states under international law not to aid and abet or support in any way the continuation of occupation, discrimination, and so on. The obligation of individual states, basically. Could that be the next step that occurs here after this report?
Absolutely. And not just states, but also the obligation of individual officials, because we're getting to the point where there's been many initiatives to look for individual criminal responsibility for officials who are involved in acts that are essentially complicit in grave abuses. And look, we've seen some changes to the international order over the last several weeks in response to the new U.S. administration. And the U.S. administration has made a clear statement against international justice, for example, by sanctioning the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. The Israeli government has also recently passed a law barring entry to anybody who supports prosecutions of Israeli officials in foreign jurisdictions, including the ICC. So there's a clear division between states that do not support international justice or do so only selectively when it's somebody else, and the states who do. And the states who do, who are members of the International Criminal Court, need to be very consistent, both in funding the court independently, not particular investigations, funding the entire court and letting the court make decisions about where to put its resources, and also in implementing in arrest warrants. So if Netanyahu or Gallant try to visit any country that is a member state, including in Europe, those countries need to follow their obligations and show that they support international justice consistently by arresting anybody who is wanted by the court.
Right. Arwa, your thoughts? I mean, Palestinians will say the continued inaction on these Israeli crimes contribute to the ongoing crimes that are being committed in Gaza, in the occupied West Bank. Do you think Palestinians still have faith in the international system and the principles of justice? Are they hopeful that there will be accountability for these crimes?
I wish I could say yes to that, but in all my conversations that I've been having with Palestinians, tragically, the answer is no. They feel as if, the international system, the international community, in fact, abandoned them a long time ago. There is this very fundamental belief that, countries who do want to see an end to all of this are not doing enough to pressure those that are continuing to support Israel, whether it's through weapons or whether it's through refusing to carry out some of these arrest warrants, or even by allowing Israel to continue to denigrate, not just the international court system, but also entities like the United Nations or even UNRWA that is so heavily focused on trying to bring assistance to the Palestinian communities throughout the region. And so there's this very real, sense. And I remember a friend of mine saying, we didn't really see ourselves as less than until this post-October 7th era, where we really began to question who it is that we actually are because of this prevalent attitude that is constantly bombarding us and trying to convince us that we somehow don't deserve to exist. We know in our hearts that we do, but it feels as if we're the only ones who actually believe that. And it is an absolutely gutting thing to hear over and over again from so many.
Right. Mohammed Dahleh, your thoughts. I mean, we've been talking about the conduct of the Israeli army in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, of course, but it's not just the Israeli army, it's not just the soldiers, it's also the settlers in the occupied West Bank who are attacking Palestinian civilians, who are, subjecting them to all sorts of violence. Israel will say, when you talk about investigations and so on, Israel will say, we'll investigate. But have there been investigations within Israel for these acts of violence that are committed? And where else could Palestinians turn to if they have no faith left in the international justice system? I mean, it's a very dire picture for Palestinians, isn't it?
It is. It's very gloomy. But as you know, the Palestinians have been fighting for their rights, for their national independence, for their self-determination, they have been fighting Zionism, as a matter of fact, for more than 100 years now. And they will continue. They will continue their struggle. Forget about the international legal system and the Israeli legal system that so far proved to be useless. Even smaller actions that were taken by the previous administration, such as some sanctions against a few settlers in the West Bank who are illegally present in the West Bank, who are committing a war crime by being part of illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. We see that the current administration actually lifted those sanctions, and it changed the situation. The current administration has just hosted the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, who himself is a settler and who is supporting those illegal settlers in the West Bank, and who's calling on daily basis for the uprooting of the Palestinians from their homes and from their homeland in Gaza. We are seeing what the American administration is doing against students who are trying to protest in U.S. campuses and universities. So, the injustice is against Palestinians is inconceivable. And Palestinians, I don't want to say they are getting used to that, but they haven't said that we are tired of continuing to struggle and fight, because nobody whatsoever, wherever, will not accept injustice forever.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you all for being with us on Inside Story today. Mohammed Dahleh, Sari, Bashi, Arwa, Damon, thank you so much for your time. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.